Good morning, everyone. I think we have some folks still trickling in here, but we can go ahead and get started. For folks who don't know me, my name is Kristen Riley. I'm the director of the Choose Clean Water Coalition. Welcome to our Back to the Future webinar series, the first webinar of this series today. Just for a little background for folks, again, if you're coming to this a little new, because we shared this webinar pretty far and wide. Choose Clean Water Coalition, we are a coalition of, I believe now 300, I think we can officially say 300 coalition members across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. We are focused on advancing clean water and healthy communities across the entire watershed, with an emphasis on restoring the Chesapeake Bay. We are very closely tied to the Bay restoration effort. It's part of our founding in 2009 when we were pulled together. One of the charges of the coalition was really to make sure that the restoration effort stayed on track, that we were making sure the jurisdictions in the Bay and the federal agencies were doing what they needed to do in order to be successful. And so here we are now approaching 2025, and we're in a very critical moment for the restoration effort, and really wanting to provide an opportunity for not just the coalition members, but partners and stakeholders across the watershed to learn more about sort of the origins of this entire restoration effort, where we are in recent history and where we are going, because over the next year and couple of years, we're really going to be leaning into what does the future of this restoration effort look like. And we all want to be a part of that conversation. It's important for the NGO community, for stakeholders, practitioners to have a role and a say in how we're approaching our work and what needs to evolve and change for us in order for us to be successful. And so we want to start with this webinar series to really help educate folks and get people, on the same page about that. And we are very lucky because we have some amazing folks, both on our staff, both within our coalition, but also folks that we've, developed relationships with over the years, who are willing to come out of retirement in some cases to help us tell this story. And so we're really just very thankful to all the folks that you'll be hearing from over the course of this webinar series, but especially today. And so with that, I can introduce our two panelists for today. So again, today is going to be focusing on, oh my gosh, you made it happen, Drew. You did it. Today is going to be focused on the past, the origins, where we're going all the way back to the beginning, as we get into the DeLorean here with Carin Bisland. I can't introduce Carin in a serious manner with her getting into a DeLorean with Peter Marx, but Carin is the retired branch chief at US EPA Chesapeake Bay Program office. Folks may also be familiar with Carin. She was our Clean Water Champion Award winner at our conference in Pennsylvania. Also just have a very a lot of love for Carin as my first boss when I graduated out of college, and I worked at the Bay Program as my first job. Was a really amazing mentor for me and learned a lot from her. And she has tons of experience within EPA and more broadly within the environmental movement. And so she'll have a lot of knowledge and expertise to share with us on the history of this effort. And then hopefully the other face that you see on here, Peter Marx, isn't too unfamiliar to a lot of you. Peter is the coalition's federal affairs contractor, just coming off an amazing Chesapeake Bay Day on Capitol Hill last week and right into this presentation as well. So thank you guys, thank both of you all for taking time out of your retirement, Carin, and your busy schedule, Peter, to do this today. I think, Drew, do you want to talk about logistics for questions and stuff like that? I wasn't sure where we landed on how you wanted to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen, for that great introduction. So folks can put in questions into the Q&A. If it's timely and pertinent to the conversation, I will interrupt Carin, Peter, to ask the question. Otherwise, feel free to hold on to them for the end. And if you'd rather ask your question orally at the end of the presentation, we can open up mics so that folks can ask their questions that way. But I think with that, we're ready to get started.
Sounds good. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Kristen. So, welcome to the Wayback Machine. That's my job here. So we're going to be talking about things from quite a while ago. I was a little on the young side, so I was too young to accompany John Smith up the bay, but I was here for a lot of this other stuff. But we're going to talk about, this is also the Wayback Machine. So we're going to start in 1972, and kind of it was really a really significant moment for the bay, and also for, in a large part, the beginning of bay restoration and concerns, public concerns about the bay. And that was when Tropical Storm Agnes hit our region. It was actually a hurricane coming up the bay, or when it was coming up the Atlantic coast, but it turned into a tropical storm, and it kind of hurtled up Chesapeake Bay into the upper watershed all the way up into New York. And it was devastating. It was massive floods. And one of the unique things about Agnes when it hit is it hit very early in the hurricane season. It hit in June. So there was tremendous damage from floods, but it was the ecological damage that really became something that was really noticed. There was just tremendous pulses of sediment, all kinds of pollution that got just loaded into the bay at an extremely sensitive time. You know, one of the things is the Susquehanna Flats at the mouth of the Susquehanna River in the Upper Bay had these massive underwater grass beds. They were just starting to sprout, and all the sediment came in, and it knocked back SAV really through today. It was just tremendous, and the bay was kind of a noticeably damaged from all the results of Tropical Storm Agnes. While this was also going on, 1972 was kind of a keystone year for a lot of focus on environment. It was at a time within a few years where a lot of our just our basic national environmental legislation had passed. In 1972, the Clean Water Act passed and became law. One thing also, it passed and became law. First, it was passed by Congress, and it was vetoed by President Nixon. A lot of people claimed he was the environmental president, and a lot of legislation did go through when he was president that he did sign, but the Clean Water Act was vetoed, and then Congress overrid his veto. And this was also at a time when the Clean Water Act and a lot of the focus, even in the Chesapeake, was all the pollution was coming from point sources. It was coming from industry and factories, spewing, pollutants in from pipes. But it became clear that was something else going on, and that's what Agnes did. So soon after Agnes, and the impacts for the bay were clear in 72, and into the next year, into 1973, and Senator Mac Mathias from Maryland, a Republican senator from Maryland, was really concerned about the damage to the bay, and he did kind of a famous little bay tour. He did several of them, but he did a 5-day tour of Chesapeake Bay to try and I think he just stayed in the Maryland portion of the bay. I'm not 100% sure, but I know he left from Baltimore and returned to Baltimore. But he went to survey the damage to the bay, talk to a lot of people, to watermen, to boaters, sailors, anybody out there, and he came back really clear that there was a noticeable problem for the bay, and it had to be resolved. And he kind of went on a one-man campaign for a while to try and get funding to try and figure out what was going on with the bay, what the damage was, and how you rectify it. So what he wound up doing was getting Congress a few years later. It took him a few years. He was able to pass a very large 5-year study by EPA to do a scientific study of all the problems with the bay, what the problems were and what the causes were, and some recommendations on how to address that. So it was a 5-year study. It was about $27 million, which was really big money back then. And a 5-year study by EPA. It was kind of combined. There was an EPA lab in Annapolis, and they were kind of used as a centerpiece for this big study on the bay. And I think they finished the study in like 1981, and it took a year and a half to get the massive reports done and out. And that was kind of the lead to, go to the next one. That's really what led to the very first Chesapeake Bay Agreement in 1983. It was soon after the study came out from EPA, and one of the clear things, there were a few things that were, I guess, surprising at the time. One was that, it wasn't industry, it wasn't these pipes that was the predominant problem for the bay. It identified nutrients as really the big impairment for the bay, and also was very clear that Maryland or Virginia, or even the two states combined, could not together resolve the problems for the bay. It had to be a watershed-wide approach, and there was a huge focus on trying to make sure that Pennsylvania got involved. That's where the bulk of the watershed and bulk of the issues were coming from back then and to this day. And that led to this first agreement, which, as that little arrow there shows, is how short it was. It was really short and sweet and to the point. Basically said, we shall all work together, and it was the three original states of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which were the state legislators from those three states, the mayor of DC, Barry at the time, and EPA representing the federal government. So that's really what it was. That's kind of really started the Chesapeake Bay Program. That was the origins. It did also that called for them working together, and that an EPA Chesapeake Bay, they called it a Chesapeake Bay liaison office, would be established to kind of manage and steer this new partnership on Chesapeake Bay. So I'm just going to go a little bit further, just some of I think my role here is to be a little bit of the color commentator for some politics as we go through this. So I'll end with this one little political thing too, that in 1984, most people don't view Ronald Reagan as the environmental president, even less so than Nixon, who actually did a lot. But Reagan, who got elected in 1980, he had a couple of cabinet appointments who had some issues with the general public on being anti-environment. He had James Watt, who at the time was infamous. He was the Secretary of Interior and was anti-environmental protection. He was pretty upfront about it. And he also appointed a woman named Ann Gorsuch Burford as the administrator of EPA, and she had some issues. There were some ethics issues, and also a lot of issues about EPA basically taking this relatively new agency taking their foot off the gas when it came to enforcing environmental laws. And one of the unusual things here, I guess it's especially in bay restoration and a lot of our stuff, is all these people who generations are involved in bay restoration, or just people we recognize. Up here we have, for all the youngsters here, that photo on the left standing up is George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, whose son became president. We have Tip O'Neill, that's the white-haired guy. He was the Speaker of the House from Massachusetts, and Reagan is there at the podium. Reagan and O'Neill actually got along pretty well. They differed a lot on politics, quite a bit. And one of the things that was kind of happened at this State of the Union in 1984 is Reagan was getting bashed on environment, and he tried to, and it was because of his cabinet appointees, James Watt and Ann Gorsuch Burford, whose son, by the way, is Neil Gorsuch, who is on the Supreme Court now. He was a Trump appointee to the Supreme Court. The Merrick Garland spot, as some people would say. Anyway, Reagan used his State of the Union speech and mention of Chesapeake Bay, calling it a national treasure, to try and come up with a good environmental platform. And his environmental platform was basically saying the Chesapeake Bay was a national treasure and we should protect it. And it was later in that year that EPA acquiesced to, and supported the signing of that first agreement. And while this was all going on, there was a little bit of competition on the bay. Tip O'Neill kind of famously did a little boat trip on the bay as well, kind of Mac Mathias style, and brought press along to try and highlight that he was as concerned about Chesapeake Bay and the environment as the president. And while that was going on, a congressman from Maryland, Roy Dyson, Democrat, he had organized a bay trip. I think he organized a couple of them, and he brought along 8 legislators, 8 other members of the House, Democrats and Republicans. It was a whole different era. And Roy Dyson brought these members of Congress out on the bay, had media with him, and was very, very focused on, I want to get $10 million for this new effort to restore the bay. And he was bringing his colleagues out, Democrats and Republicans, to say, see how important this is, see what's happened to this bay, and we need to fix it, and we need your help in getting money. It took a little while, but soon after this, with Reagan and the State of the Union address, Tip O'Neill doing a boat tour, Roy Dyson taking colleagues out of the bay. In FY84, the Chesapeake Bay Program got federal funding for $4.6 million, starting from zero. And soon after, the next year in FY85, the Bay Program got $10.2 million. So Roy Dyson got his $10 million after only a couple of years, and kind of the political congressional support for Bay restoration had kind of taken hold. And we also had a Chesapeake Bay Program and an agreement. And I will turn it over to Carin to talk about the 80s, the rest of the 80s.
The rest of the 80s. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I think that one of the things that I wanted to stress about the earlier part that Peter just talked about in terms of the politics, it was also really important that 1983 to 1987 was hugely important to the development of the partnership, and the partnership and the trust that had to happen between all of the members of the partnership. The 83 agreement did call for an executive council of the 6 members of the agreement. And they also called for an implementation committee, which is now the management board, to work through some of the issues together. And for an area that where states didn't necessarily always get along, think of just the oyster wars on the Potomac Vine. This was really a big deal. And I think one of the things that I wanted to stress about that is between 1983 and 1987, it seemed like that was a long period of time, but it was really a time that created some of those trusted partnerships that were necessary to be able to continue to move forward. One of the things that married the science that Peter talked about in the 70s with the partnership is that we had a monitoring program that was very unusual. And even today, it's very unusual that the monitoring program went between Maryland, Virginia, and DC public waters, and it was consistent. So you can compare the results of any water quality monitoring in Virginia with those in Maryland and DC. Also, the model that was created also allowed everybody to see and were able to see, relatively speaking, across the watershed. So the science helped the partnership to create a sense of trust that everybody knew what was happening everywhere. So that took a long time, but that was really what happened between 83 and 87. The other thing that happened between 83 and 87 that was important is that EPA took the role seriously, that they represented the federal agencies, and they worked to develop MOUs with pertinent federal agencies to bring forward what they could do for the Chesapeake Bay through those MOUs. Fast forward to 1987, There were a couple of things that happened. One was there was a new agreement that was signed. The 1987 agreement was, oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I got it out of, the 1987 agreement was a lot different than the 1983 agreement. It was much longer, but it also had commitments in it for the partnership to achieve. So the partnership worked on developing trust from 83 to 87, so that in 1987 they could all agree on what commitments they were planning to move forward on together. And those commitments, while often people think that this program was just about water quality all along, not necessarily true. Those commitments spanned living resources, water quality, toxics, population growth and development, public access, governance. So it was a pretty ecosystem-wide agreement in 1987. The other significant thing about the 87 agreement was it was the first quantitative commitment that was made in the Chesapeake, and probably one of the first nationally. It was one of the first. It called for a 40% nutrient reduction by the year 2000. And that was really big, to be focusing on a particular goal that was measurable by the model that was created by the partnership. And what was interesting about that is that between 1987 and 2000, that 40% nutrient reduction commitment was redefined and redefined. So it was redefined originally as controllable, so that it took the air and the headwater state contribution to the load out of the equation. And it also took the lower Virginia tributaries out of the equation because they didn't impact the Chesapeake Bay. So as we move forward from 1987 to 2000, and as we got closer to meeting the goal, it was redefined in a way that that limited what it was there for. The other thing I think that I wanted to say about the 1980s, between 1987 and 2000, is that there was an amendment in 1992 that allowed for the tributary, the program to move up into the tributaries. So until then, it was mostly the tidal waters, and it was the focus of the tidal waters. But it moved up to the tributaries to develop the tributary strategies, which were really the precursors for what's today the TMDL, because it was assigning the load to tributaries. It started the states working with their localities a little bit more, coming up with tributary strategies to achieve by 2000. The other thing that it did was it started directives, adoption strategies, adoption statements. So there were fisheries management plans that were adopted by the Executive Council. There were directives such as the Forest Buffer Directive. So that between 1987 and the next agreement that was signed in 2000, there was a lot of work that the Executive Council did on specific strategies, adoptions, directives to guide and lead the program.
We go backward.
Yeah.
So to do my color commentary on politics. Right here. So for just a couple of things on that photo of the Executive Council in 1987, just this generational thing. The third person from the left is Bob Casey Sr. He was governor of Pennsylvania at the time, whose son is now senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Bob Casey, who President Biden refers to as Bobby Casey. Everybody watched the State of the Union the other night. The other thing about 1987 that's significant is going back 1 year, at the end of 1986, Congress passed the Clean Water Act amendments. It's called the Water Quality Act of 1986. And it was vetoed by President Reagan in 1986. So in 1987, the new Congress, the 100th Congress, the very first vote that Congress had in 1987, also in 1986, when they passed that bill that was vetoed by Reagan, that was Mac Mathias's last environmental vote, was on the passing of the Water Quality Act of 86, so the Clean Water Act amendments. Then in 1987, the first vote in that new Congress which also included Senator Barbara Mikulski. Her very first vote as a U.S. Senator was to override Reagan's veto of the Clean Water Act amendments, the Water Quality Act of 1987. And one of the real significance of that for the Chesapeake is that included for the first time in the Clean Water Act a Chesapeake Bay section, section 117, which is still the operative law for the Chesapeake and EPA's authority for running this program and everything else, all the funding that we get from Congress every year. It all emanates from section 117 of the Clean Water Act that passed in 1987. So it was significant.
It also codified the Chesapeake Bay Program Office from that
Right.
was in the 1983 agreement.
And also, as you noted yesterday, the National Estuary Program was in there as well.
Yeah.
Ready to go 2000?
There you go, 2000. So one of the directives that
Wait.
happened,
We want to talk about American Canoe Association lawsuit.
yes, we did.
Should I? I'll do some color commentary, but so I think it started in 1997. But this was so American Canoe Association, which is a Choose Clean Water Coalition member. It was a very arcane, under the radar lawsuit. They sued EPA over total maximum daily load, TMDL, which is it's actually surprising the very first time I looked it up. If one assumes in the Clean Water Act, there's like a section on the TMDL that's, or a subsection that says total maximum daily load. Total maximum daily load are four words, lowercase in the middle of a sentence in section 303D of the Clean Water Act. And the American Canoe Association kind of picked that out and said that EPA, because there were parts of the bay and they were focused on some tidal segments of tributaries in Virginia of the bay, they sued EPA saying, you need to do a total and maximum daily load. These areas are impaired and they're on the impaired waters list, known as the dirty waters list of the Clean Water Act. And you're required to do a total maximum daily load to basically come up with a plan on how to remove those impairments. American Canoe Association won that lawsuit in 1998, and that started the whole process of TMDLs all over the country. It was EPA hadn't done it before. There were a lot of discussions at EPA. This was during the Clinton administration. Of doing those kinds of things, but it was this lawsuit which really kind of triggered the whole implementation of TMDLs nationwide, and ultimately of the Chesapeake 2000 agreement and the Bay TMDL that Karen's going to start talking about. So sorry about that.
We'll stay on that slide because
okay.
I did miss a couple things, and I think that one is a story about the fisheries management plans, because I think that one of the things that the Chesapeake Bay Program did was they looked at all of the commercially viable fisheries and that were in the bay, and they did fisheries management plans on those, and the Executive Council signed them. This meant that a lot of the tidal fisheries were signed by non-tidal states like Pennsylvania. One of the things that I always love about the way the partnership works is that the states kept an eye on each other. And I recall with the fisheries management plans, they had a black sea bass, which is a tidal fishery. And one of it was sliding through the Chesapeake Bay Program because not a whole lot of people knew a whole lot about fisheries management related to the black sea bass. And one of the Pennsylvania reps on the implementation committee at the time said, hey, I'm reading this and it says that the limit is that you can catch these fish are 10 inches. And it says that they don't become fertile until 11 inches. So why are you doing it at 10 inches instead of 11 inches? And so it acted, the partnership always acts as a way of making sure that people are staying true to their commitments. The other thing I was going to say is that the directive that was, there was a directive that was signed in 1998. So at 1998, they were looking at the 87 agreement and it's saying, we really need a refresh. It's almost 2000. The one commitment in there that has, that's 40% nutrient reduction is by 2000. And so we really need to start looking at a new agreement. And so there was a directive signed in 1998 that they would develop a new agreement in Chesapeake in 2000. So it's very similar to the situation we're in right now, where the 2014 agreement is the 2025 is coming up, and we need to figure out where we're going from 2025 and beyond. And that's what that's what the Bay Program partners are working on right now. So it's very similar to what happened in 1998.
Carin, while we're on this, I want to digress on one little thing too, on the Forest Buffer Directive, which I know in other venues we've talked about. Some of the things about the Bay Program now that has kind of gotten lost over time is we're often doing the lowest common denominator for all of the jurisdictions when it comes to decisions and commitments. And it wasn't always the case, even though, effectively every jurisdiction had the right of veto to some degree. But that Forest Buffer Directive was a classic example of political people at the principal staff committee, so state secretaries, EPA regional administrator, and even at the executive council meeting, there was one state that was resistant to having any kind of a large number as a goal for the forest buffers. And it was a Republican governor from Virginia, Republican Secretary of Natural Resources, and they were digging in their heels about wanting to have a really small number. And it was actually the Republican governor and Republican Secretary of Environment, I think it was DER at the time, in Pennsylvania, before DEP, before they separated them out, but whatever. And they really were kind of castigating representatives from Virginia, just saying, if you're going to insist on a really low number, that's fine, but your governor is going to have to defend this at the press conference, and you really want that. Well, everyone else here thinks we should have a stronger number, and ultimately at the executive council, my recollection is no one really knew what was going to pop out, and the Virginia governor agreed to the highest number that everybody was talking about, and in fact insisted on adding 10 miles to the goal. So it was going to be for 2010, I think was a goal, and took credit for actually upping it even another 10 miles. So a lot of times the lowest common denominator just didn't rule the day at the end. And in fact, sometimes it got thrown upside down and turned on its head by having stuff like that happen. So those were the days.
Now we can go to 2000.
Sure.
So the next agreement was Chesapeake 2000 agreement. And this one, this one was developed by in a very similar process to what you're going through today, but it was between 1998 and 2000. It was developed by a number of people, and they had critical issues forums for the critical issues that they needed to tease out a little bit more. I remember climate change was one of them. I remember wetlands was another. And so they had those, and they all came together and worked on the agreement. There was a draft agreement that came out in December because there was one commitment that they couldn't get through, which was a sound land use commitment of reducing the rate of sprawl. And so they had the draft come out, and then they later on had the signed agreement after a public comment period, a large public comment period. Chesapeake 2000 ended up being 101 commitments. That's a heck of a lot of commitments across the variety of things that you can see on the screen right now. And it was signed by the original 6 executive council members. And one of the things that I think was really strong in that is that what we needed to do is we needed to bring together the regulatory program, the total maximum daily load, water quality criteria and standards with the way we were doing things in the Chesapeake Bay Program partnership. And so it really, in the water quality section, very much focused on how to delist the waters by 2010, how to develop criteria and standards based on the fantastic monitoring programs that we had a long-term series on, and the most recent research. And it played a significant role in establishing the scientific guidelines of the Future of the Bay program. I don't know if you wanted to add anything related to that.
No.
No. One of the things that it also did was it called for us to be working with headwater states. And so headwater states did sign an MOU with the Chesapeake Bay Program Executive Council. Between 2002 and 2003, the MOU that they signed them onto the water quality portion of the agreement. Not everything out, not the whole agreement, but the water quality portion of the agreement. So when I was talking earlier about the 40% nutrient reduction being controllable loads and taking the headwater states out of the role of headwater states out of the calculation for 40% nutrient reduction, this put them back into the equation, and it had to for the later development of the total maximum daily load.
I had one for that.
Mm-hmm.
So on the headwater states, actually, I think the first headwater state that signed onto that portion of the agreement was actually in 2000. So I did want to do a shout out just in our small little world, how this isn't generational, but Tom Carper, who is currently senator from Delaware, who is retiring at the end of this year. Tom Carper was the one he was governor of Delaware at the time in 2000. And Delaware has their motto is the first state, and they have this shtick about always wanting to be the first state. So Tom Carper, as governor, went to great lengths to make sure that they were the first of those 3 headwater states to sign the MOU. And I remember as governor, Carper did a signing ceremony on a farm in Sussex County in the Bay watershed. But also Tom Carper, he had the Triple Crown for Delaware. He was House member, governor, and senator. And when he was a House member, he voted for the original 1987 Clean Water Act amendments, which created the Chesapeake Bay Program. Then he signed the MOU in 2000 to sign Delaware onto the water quality parts of the Bay watershed agreements. And even today, as Senator and Chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, this morning, that committee is marking up the reauthorization of the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program, reauthorization of the Fish and Wildlife Service Chesapeake Wild Program, and reauthorization of the Chesapeake Gateways Program. So it's like all these folks are wearing different hats, but still all involved in bay restoration. And that was also one thing I did forget to mention earlier. The Chesapeake Gateways passed Congress in 1998 as one of my favorite laws that it was attached to was part of the Rhinoceros and Tiger Conservation Act of 1998, and that passed the Chesapeake Bay bill, which created gateways, which is still kicking today. That was it for me.
It's funny because it's so hard right now to go through this many years and hit on everything that was important. And I know that those of you that know me are probably surprised that I'm not focusing more on other things like living resources and habitat that are dear to my heart and very important to the restoration of the Chesapeake. I think one of the things that I would say is that while water quality is a focus and priority of the program, we will not reach what our vision is if we don't focus on the other aspects of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. And in 2000, and in 1987 and 2000, it really set up commitments to achieve all of the ecosystem priorities and the people priorities, land conservation, public access, as communication and education as well. So we have had a long history of other things that are important to our restoration effort, water quality always being one of the top priorities. So saying that, I would say that in 2007, the water quality goal was to delist the bay by 2010. In 2007, that it was recognized that we weren't going to meet the 2010 goal. And Governor O'Malley, who was then the Executive Council chair, not only called for a new long-term goal, but he said he was thinking about how he prioritizes things and how he looks at how things are important to him. And if it's outside of his reign as governor, he doesn't focus on it as much. And so he wanted to make sure that we also considered shorter 2-year milestones. And so the 2-year milestones that maybe you're familiar with in the way that we do the total maximum daily load in the Chesapeake Bay was started because he wanted to be held accountable to these shorter term goals. Governor Kane became chair of the Executive Council after Governor O'Malley, and it was his responsibility to implement the 2-year milestones. What does it mean to have 2-year milestones? What does it look like to have 2-year milestones? And that was a really critical part of the agreement, the accountability framework that maybe many of you might be familiar with in the Chesapeake Bay related to the total maximum daily load is implementing how we would go about achieving the 2-year milestones in addition to another long-term goal. The other thing that then Governor Kane, now Senator Kane, did was he developed an ask for he wasn't actually yet elected, President-elect Obama, for the federal agencies to take more leadership. And that, I'm squeezing past 2008 a little bit because President Obama signed the very first executive order for the Chesapeake Bay restoration. And it really called for federal agencies to take leadership, develop a strategy, and convene a federal leadership committee, which is super important to how we are today with the federal leadership being so much broader than just EPA, particularly when we're talking about areas where the mission is not EPA's, but it's under the purview of other federal agencies. The executive order really enhanced as I started out saying, in 1983 to 1987, EPA did MOUs. Later on, the federal agencies did a combined strategy. And then in 2009, the executive order 2010, they developed a strategy for how the federal agencies were going to provide leadership in the Chesapeake Bay.
Can I go back? You gave me a prompt before and I totally missed it, and it was a swing and a miss, but I'm going to try and hit this next pitch, which was for Chesapeake 2000, which I always refer to as the TMDL avoidance agreement. And this was based on the 1998 American Canoe Association case that they won against EPA about requiring EPA to do TMDLs for the listed segments of the bay in Virginia. And that whole Chesapeake 2000 agreement was all structured in a large part. For folks from Virginia were pushing it because it was to avoid that court case. The legal decision said that if those segments of the bay in Virginia the impairments were not removed, if they were not restored by, I think it was May 1st, 2011, then EPA would have to implement a TMDL for those areas. And that was something that Virginia wanted to avoid. So the whole Chesapeake 2000 agreement was structured to allow for a voluntary mechanism to get to the same goal, which was to remove impairments by the year 2000. And the deal was, if at some point it was determined that those deadlines were not going to be met, that the bay wasn't going to effectively be restored by May 1st, 2011, then a TMDL would be imposed. So that was what Carin had referenced, that in 2007, everybody said, we're not going to make it. And it kind of goes back also to some of the things Carin was talking about. We had the 87 agreement for the 40% reduction in nutrients, and often those deadlines would kind of be not exactly changed, but reinterpreted. So the 40% reduction became 40% of controllable loads. So things like the headwater states or air deposition didn't count toward the load. And then it was those areas that only impacted the bay. So then the lower tribs in Virginia were not necessarily part of that 40% reduction. And even now we have the TMDL and we have the 2014 Bay Agreement, which calls for all mechanisms to be in place that are needed for a clean bay by 2025, which is not a clean bay. That is not meeting the TMDL and removing impairments and getting the Chesapeake Bay or any of its 92 segments removed from the 303D list of impaired waters. Even if we were to get all mechanisms in place, we probably wouldn't have a clean bay for decades, maybe, or longer. Anyway, sorry.
All good.
Okay, so I think we're at the place where I guess I would sum up things in sort of 3 takeaways. You know, I think the Chesapeake Bay Program, what it is and continues to be unique in not only in size and scope, but also in how it brings together science and politics and an engaged citizenry. And I think that we do a lot with indicators and communications and education to make sure that there's an engaged citizenry or engaged stakeholders. We also continue to bring together the science and politics. There's a lot of science that continues today, not just what happened in the 70s, that feeds what's happening at the policy level. And so all 3 of them are really important to keep together in order to move forward as a Chesapeake Bay program. The other thing I would say is that it's not a sprint. It's a relay race. I hate it when I hear people say things like we failed and therefore we failed the voluntary program and therefore we're doing the total maximum daily load. I don't find that that's the case. I find it's a relay race. I find that each of the legs in the timeline have built upon the last leg in that timeline, and we would not have had the extensive, largest total maximum daily load in the country if we didn't have the partnership between 83 and 87 building trust, the commitments that they worked together on between 87 and 2008 or 2009, 2010, before the TMDL was in place. So don't look at it as one failed, therefore the other the other one's turn. But look at it as how do you build from what has already been built? How do you keep what works really well? How do you get rid of what doesn't work very well? And I think that the third thing is that we don't have very much patience often, but it takes patience. Peter was just talking about, we'll have mechanisms in place to be able to delist the Chesapeake Bay, but it's going to take a while for the Bay to respond to those mechanisms. It takes patience, and it also takes patience to negotiate and build consensus. If you're going to have a trusted partnership, if you're going to be able to move forward together, it's important to do things up front, because it's not the lowest common denominator.
Oh, we got something up.
And then we can take questions.
Cool. So yeah, folks have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. You also you can just write in the Q&A that you'd like to ask a question orally, and I can take you off of mute. So feel free to ask away.
And I'm sure that there are other people that are online that have had experiences through that time period as well, that probably have different experiences. So feel free to bring those forward too.
And our apologies that we missed loads of milestones that we just couldn't get them all in. We'd just be ticking down our list.
You guys did a good job, so we don't have any questions. Got one excellent presentation.
Everybody's asleep.
I'll get started with Q&A. What do you think in regards to how this time period from the mid-70s or so through 2009, how do you think that kind of of course we're gonna have 2 other webinars talking about this, but how does that kind of lay the foundation for what comes next? What are the main principles that going off of your takeaways, Carin, but what are the main principles that we could use as we're looking for not just 15 years after that, but as we're kind of charting what's going to come after 2025?
I think that being adaptive is something that I would say is really important, because we don't have all the answers. We didn't have all the answers in the 70s, but we could get started. We didn't have them in the 80s, but we could move forward, and we could readjust. The 40% nutrient reduction in 1987, having to change that to controllable loads, that was a learning process, and the tributary strategies was a learning process. So how do you learn? How do you adapt to where you are now? And how do you step back? Because this time frame is a really big chance to step back and look at where you are and where you want to be, and reframe it if you need to, or not. If you're going in the right direction, you don't need to, but it's a time to step back and really think about where we're going.
We got another good question. This one might be more in your wheelhouse, Peter. Could you talk a bit about the state of working across the aisle in today's political climate? Any jokes for that?
To our benefit, Chesapeake Bay specifically, even clean water, you almost never hear anyone against clean water, but especially Chesapeake Bay, everyone will say, every politician will say they care about Chesapeake Bay, they want to clean Chesapeake Bay. They will differ in how you get there, but no one's bad-mouthing the Bay. Everybody thinks it's a great idea. So that's one thing. At least we don't have a polarization over that at this point. I always use, as an example, just a personal anecdote. There's a Republican congressman from North Central Pennsylvania, Glenn G.T. Thompson. He's now the chairman of the House Ag Committee, but we first got involved with him a number of years ago when he was just kind of a backbench Republican, and we took him out. He was interested, his staff said he was interested in touring some small watershed grant projects that were funded through the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program in his district, and we were selective and made sure that we took him to some of these projects that were working on farms and gave him a tour. And he was a very reasonable guy, and he was right off the bat was, I got to tell you, I don't like the TMDL, and often there's an amendment in Congress to stop EPA from enforcing the TMDL. And he said, I'm going to vote for it every time. He said, but I'm all for trying to get more money to give to my farmers who want to do something on a voluntary basis. And I'll work with you on getting more money for the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program and more money for the grants, because they're going to things that I think are good. And I think we have a responsibility upstream to help the Bay, but I don't want anyone forcing my constituents to do that. So in the scheme of things, I took that as a win, and there was common ground we can work on. We didn't agree on everything, but there's still that stuff going on, less so than it used to be, but still exists. So relatively speaking, my job is a lot easier on the Hill than a lot of other people where the issues themselves get polarized. Ours haven't really.
Another good question in the political realm from Kyle Hart regarding, you said we saw a lot of familiar names in the presentation. Tim Kaine mentioned Tom Carper, who have taken on different roles.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how institutional knowledge versus new faces in the political arena impacts this conversation?
Yeah, Carin and I were just talking about that with With our lobby day last week and our lunch, Kristen gave out Chesapeake Champion Awards to 3 retiring members of Congress, or as like especially John Sarbanes would say, he's not retiring, he's just not seeking re-election. But 3 members of Congress, all 3 happen to be from Maryland, all Democrats from Maryland. Senator Ben Cardin, who just the heavy lifting he has done over decades for the Bay, from the state level to the U.S. House of Representatives to the U.S. Senate. Dutch Ruppersberger, who's been on the House Appropriations Committee for decades and was key to us maintaining and increasing funding for Bay restoration. And John Sarbanes, congressman from Maryland, son of Senator Paul Sarbanes from Maryland. And John Sarbanes is, he grew up with Bay legislation because his dad was the one who got the Gateways Bill in 1998 onto the Rhinoceros and Tiger Conservation Act, and he got funding for the small watershed grants. He started a lot of stuff for Bay restoration. So they're hard to replace. They're definitely hard to replace. And all 3 of those at the same time is tough. There will be new people coming in. I don't want to get into candidates for elective office, but there are some folks out there, new faces who have experience in Bay restoration and being strong proponents of it that, hopefully just be a next generation of leadership. That's what happens. And they don't have to be related to someone who's currently there, although often with us they are. But
I think that there's a lot of, and I would answer, I think that there's a lot of new faces and retired people like myself in beyond just the congressional and political realm. And, I think all across the country, we're seeing a lot of retirement of some of the older faces of the environmental world. I don't think that that's a bad thing. But I think that right now we're moving into an area that none of us has experience in with climate change and problems and issues that we didn't deal with in historically. And I think that having new ideas, new faces, new paradigms is a really positive thing. But I would also offer that you don't forget about the past, because the past can teach you things. It can teach you processes, ways of doing things, but it can also teach you, it can teach you things to avoid. And so don't, I would say that yay, we're getting new faces, and that's a really good thing, but just don't forget about the past.
So I know we're at time. We have 3 more questions, and so I'm going to combine 2 of them because I think they both would end us on a positive note. So first one, to summarize, apathy plaguing the environmental conversation, how do we counteract that? And then another one from Jeff Corbin, who's presenting our next webinar. This is a fun one, good one to end on. If you were king and queen for the day to make the most progress in the next decade, what would be the one next step you would make happen? A new law, a new lawsuit, a new funding mechanism. So I think you can combine that with how to counteract apathy too. So what are your final thoughts to react to that?
The apathy thing, it's hard. We've been at it for a long time, and often when something's new, it's exciting. And when you've been doing it for a while, it becomes harder, and there is apathy. But when I was looking to prepare for this, I was looking at some of the historical documents, and one of the things that they were plagued with was finding things that were mutually beneficial across the partners, because the partners didn't necessarily always get along and didn't always go their own way, but they didn't see it being successful unless they came together. And so looking for things that are mutually beneficial is one way to remove the apathy, making sure that people feel accountable to the Chesapeake Bay and to the progress is the other. And Jeff, I was going to actually say that you would probably have a whole lot more to say about the 2-year milestones implementation at your next at the next webinar, since you were front and center in that. If I were king or queen for the day, I am not sure. I'm not
Pick
sure.
clean.
You can pick
Pick clean.
Yes, and, you know, I think that one of the upsides of the total maximum daily load is that people take it really seriously because it can have regulatory consequences. One of the downsides to it is that it puts us back into a traditional EPA versus states role, and therefore it's always, people are always criticizing EPA, including some of the state partners, and so they're not taking things as accountably as they used to, and so I'm careful about laws and regulations because I think that you lose something in the working together and feeling that you're all in it together. So I'd be careful with that. And I think that that climate change is an area of focus that everybody has, but making sure that it is specific in terms of what it is you're asking people to do and how it combines with what needs to happen with the Chesapeake Bay Program. I was thinking about this morning, but we always talk about the natural resources, but it's also the economy and it's also public safety and health that are involved with where we're going. Planting trees in urban areas that helps with the temperature in those areas. Doing a lot of things that we need to do for the Chesapeake Bay and its restoration also help with the economy and also help with the with public safety. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but those are the things that I would say.
So that gave me time to think about my answer if I was king,
You're
so.
welcome.
King Peter.
And I'm not advocating anything in particular, but just to go back to the bedrock part of the Clean Water Act was from 1972, and I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. Back then, it was burning rivers, the Cuyahoga River on fire, and the big pipes from factories just spewing crap everywhere. That was the big focus. Things have changed over time, over the past half century and change. Agriculture was specifically exempted in that Clean Water Act, and I'm not proposing regulating agriculture, but I think in this, the clean, I don't believe there's going to be any time in the near future where the Clean Water Act can come up for an update in Congress, because I think there's just dangers of it getting worse and gutted. But in a perfect world, it would be time to update it for the mid 21st century instead of the mid 20th century, which is really what it addressed.
Any final thoughts?
Aside from lunch.
We'll let everyone go. Thank you everyone for hanging on a little past time. Thank you, Carin and Peter, for sharing your experience and knowledge and insights. We will be back next week. It's next Tuesday at 10 a.m. With Jeff Corbin and Hillary Falk from Chesapeake Bay Foundation, talking about the next era of the Bay restoration effort. From Obama's executive order in 2009 through now. So catch us back then for that, and feel free to share the registration page, and stay tuned for recording of today's webinar. But thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.